So this is the follow up to War, Race and Gender. And War, Race and Gender, the 12-step process or 12-step program for invasion and domestic violence type behaviour. It's outlined. And some examples were given how it relates to domestic violence, the history of Australia, and with the conclusion, obviously, that the Ron Rebellion is ongoing in Australia. It's just changed its tactics and its appearance, and also its characters, because some of the people that are involved in the rebellion are not descendants of the Ribbon Men or the Orange Order at all. But perhaps other revolutionary groups or whatever, so trade unions, for example, Yorker Stockade, things like that. Let's look at this idea of how this relates to the idea of the heroes being the criminals and the criminals being the heroes. So in societies that worship warfare, which is typically what they're doing if they're a society that has its law or cultural customs built around the Bible, for example, which is a book of war. And actually, traditionally, in the ancient times before Judaism became monotheistic, Jehovah or Yahweh was a war god associated with blacksmithing. Okay, and he was it was almost like a Phoenician or Canaanites Hephaestus character. So it's almost like Hephaestus was the god of the Canaanites in ancient times, and then when those groups started to splinter and move around and then move back again and things got complicated, eventually Jehovah divorces from his consort Ashtart, and the religion becomes monotheistic, and as well as henotheistic, which is a totally different idea. And the stories are very much centered around warfare, as a consequence of perhaps as a cultural reaction to the many wars that the people of Judea were participating in and were being subjected to. So it was going both ways. And so the consequence of that, as well as the New Testament being authored by the Roman Empire, shows that the Bible is a book about war. And the idea of spiritual warfare is a big deal in the Christian denominations. They believe quite strongly in the continuous battle between light and dark and good and evil, and the idea of duality. It's also very hierarchical, partially as a consequence of when Yahvism became monotheistic or henotheistic. The society was becoming more hierarchical as well. It was sort of like a chief grandpa boss type character scenario with hints at one point. As a consequence of some of those groups, including some Assyrians that had gone to northern Egypt, when they left there during the time of the Santorini eruption, they had adopted a more hierarchical approach to society from the Egyptians, and the Canaanites and other groups there were becoming more hierarchical as well for other reasons. And so when Ashtar got kicked out as a goddess and Yahvism became a patriarchal religion, it was strongly centered around warfare and battles. The theme of light and dark and good and evil is central to a lot of European cultures as well, because of the snow cult type phenomenon, where for parts of their year they have abject darkness and snow that's like 10, 15 metres high, and it's minus 40 degrees centigrade, so they're freezing their asses off. So when it's cold and it's dark, it's bad. And so, and for them, when it's sunny and warm, it's good. And so, in a context of Australia, so this should just show how the context of an environment can drastically alter people's perceptions of what might be classified as good and evil. So this light-dark mythology doesn't really apply in Australia, in the sense that in the months of January and February in the Gregorian calendar are typically the hottest months on the Australian continent. And some places reach 50 degrees centigrade at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. There are entire weeks, not the entire time period, but there are entire blocks of weeks, which could be on average 45 degrees centigrade at the heat of the day. And in some cases, in some places, it could be 35 degrees centigrade at 2 o'clock in the morning. So when it's pitch black at night time, it could be hotter than a heat wave in a European summer. So the massive difference in temperature with the seasons typically means that the Australian winter is on average about the same temperature as the European autumn, closer to summertime, and the European spring, closer to summertime. Some places do get to 0 or -0, but at most, on average, you get about 6 degrees centigrade. So this idea of light and dark being the basis of whether or not the environment is sending cues to the people about what is preferable or not preferable, good or evil, is not something that Australians are necessarily accustomed to climatically. More accustomed to the idea that it's a huge amount of regional variation actually, because some places do have monsoon seasons and others don't. So it gets to be it's a continent, so it's kind of a weird one. On average, temperature-wise, though, based on the January-February phenomena of having night times with 35 degrees centigrade, in other words, a heat wave in European summer, means that climatically it is unrelatable. That snow idea from Europe is unrelatable. And, okay, and so, Frosty the Snowman playing in December at Australian shopping centres is quite laughable when you've just walked from your car into the shopping centre and in that 10-metre walk you've gotten second-degree burns. It really, really, really can get that bad. Frosty the Snowman, is that the air conditioner? Yeah. Okay, is it the air conditioner? Like, come on. Okay, it's not really relatable. So let's go back to this idea of heroes as criminals and criminals as heroes. So in a situation where the mythology and the symbolism of cultures from snow-cold places and the Middle East and North Africa as well, and presumably parts of China for their climatic reasons, they do get snow there. But we definitely know for sure that it's a strongly European phenomenon. Those types of ideas, okay, where there's constant battles and stuff like that. They've had different aristocrats battling each other and just kept going on and on like that, okay. That was their normal. Warfare was their normal in their culture. And so people like the Crusaders, for example, in medieval Europe were classified as heroes. They were even deified as saints, or not deified, but they were canonized as saints by the Vatican. These are people who invaded someone else's territory and committed mass murder. They were canonized as saints. So the idea of a saint being a good person in that particular context sounds morally corrupt because they killed people. How can invading someone else's country and abusing their inhabitants, even destroying or killing them, qualify as genuine heroic behaviour? A hero in Australia is something that you probably find people can relate to, is someone from the fire brigade. Okay, in Australia, if you're from the fire brigade, you're fucking loved. Okay, because anytime there is fire season in Australia, it's absolutely horrendous. The fires in Australia are just ridiculously hot. You're talking about literal bushlands exploding in some cases. Like a house can explode. Okay, when the big bushfires happened just before COVID started, the entire continent erupted in flames. There were other parts of the world in fire as well. It was a very dodgy time when that happened. And there was a tornado made from fire in South Australia. Okay? Now, if you are in Australia and you go, yeah, Australia, mate, that's pretty rough for Australia, but still Australia, mate, on the fires, right? Okay? You'd be pretty happy with that. Okay? So the idea of the fire brigade being seen as heroes because they're putting those nasty fires out, okay, is people that, as respected people, it seems like genuine heroism. It also seems like genuine heroism for the park rangers who engage in the removal of the leaf litter and whatever else, and the maintenance of the parks and parklands and whatever else. Um, caring for country type of thing, to prevent excessive burnouts when bushfire seasons occur every other year or so, or every few years. And so people who work as park rangers, people who are in the fire brigade, these kind of people are classified as heroes. Likewise for the coastal communities where surfing is considered a important recreational activity, the lifesavers are considered heroes. Another group of people that are considered heroes in Australia are people who work in the medical profession, and in particular people from a group called the RFDS. So if you're from overseas, you've probably heard of the Royal Flying Doctor Service. If not, you have now. A group of people sometime, a guy named Flynn, I forgot his first name, but a guy named Flynn sometime in the past decided that there were some outstations and communities that could benefit from better medical care, and why not just fly a doctor in on his little Cessna? And so he started doing that. Everyone thought that was the best thing since sliced bread. And so now we have a full-blown RFDS, which is the envy of the world over. It hasn't completely bridged the gap, so to speak, when it comes to healthcare in different communities and whatever else. There's still major structural problems. For example, Alice Springs Hospital doesn't, maybe they've changed it since then, but as at about 6 or 7 years ago, didn't have a heart monitoring machine or measurement machine. So anyone who was exhibiting those symptoms had to be flown to Royal Adelaide or to Darwin, usually to Royal Adelaide. And as a consequence, that applied pressure to the RFDS because the main road between Alice Springs and Adelaide, a sizable section of it is part of the Woomera declared zone, and so if there is a bit of difficulty getting your ambulance that's up there, especially when it's an 18-hour drive. So the idea of long distance travel in Australia is quite commonplace. And something like the RFDS is considered a godsend. Even for people who don't subscribe to the idea of God, they would still say that that's a lovely thing to do. So those are examples of what you might call genuine heroism. People who are helping other people because they care and it's required. Okay, and so those are obvious ones. Examples of situations where criminality might be described as heroism are examples of crusaders. So when you get things like military groups, groups that have invaded other countries, okay, and they've disrupted that community, they've destroyed their village, people have died, there's been horror, napalm, Agent Orange, whatever it might be, bloodshed, nightmares, PTSD, the PITS as well, which is the perpetrator-induced traumatic syndrome. All manner of toxicity and horror has occurred. And for some reason, those people come home to a ticker-tape parade and they get given a statue. And they're sitting in their house, they're going, the morality doesn't add up. The morality doesn't add up for those people. It doesn't add up. There's something awry about how can they possibly be a hero when it is plain as day that people died and suffered as a consequence of their presence and the presence of their compatriots. Those people get very confused because they don't want to have a negative self-appraisal. They know they've done something that they would consider criminal. They've been asked to do so, however, by the government. And so that raises some interesting questions. If the government is the group that creates law or legislation, and then how could you be committing a moral infraction if you followed their ethics? And so what happens there is those individuals get into a state of confusion because as a soldier, for example, those people might be accustomed to following orders. They are taught to respect hierarchy. They are told to listen to the boss. The boss being the government, the general, etc., has told them to do those things. And so technically they're not considered culpable. The brass is. The politician that sent them there is. Things of that sort. And so, but that isn't enough because they know their hands did certain things. They know their hands pulled the trigger. They know lots and lots of things like that. They saw the blood. They fucking know. Okay? So, for those people to consider themselves heroes in the context of knowing their body did a moral infraction means they've become confused because they've got all this pressure where they know they're criminals. They know their government was a criminal. But at the same time, they've got a lot of stories to say that they're heroes. Oh, you know, if you didn't do that, the Viet Minh or the Viet Cong or whatever it was, I would have taken over and communism had gone everywhere. Australia could have become infested with a bunch of Pol Pots or something. Okay? It's not necessarily the truth of the situation so much as the story that they were telling at the time in that particular instance, but you can actually translate that to other fields of engagement, right? Which is, of course, a euphemism, and try and articulate what it might or might not mean in any given context. So, that type of logic where you've got this gender role where the male role is warrior and woman's role is nurturer, in a culture and society that is built around a book about war, the Bible, and you've got a situation where it starts to very much look like the 12-step process of invasion, propaganda, and so on and so forth that was articulated in the video War, Race and Gender start to look like ordinary male social conditioning. It becomes infused with male psychology. It's almost and where that has occurred is problematic. So you've got this normalisation of violence with Anzac Day. You've got this normalisation of violence where in East Gippsland there was a statue of Macmillan for a long time. Macmillan was a man who committed mass murder as part of an invasion strategy of the East Gippsland region, and just about everyone who's alive there today didn't cause that and came later, especially because that did occur before the Irish potato famine. Nonetheless, what's really obscene about it is that the surviving Aboriginal people there would have gone and told the governor of Melbourne and the Melbourne Parliament, whatever, said, no, Macmillan's done this, Macmillan's done that. We don't want to see his ugly fucking face in a statue when we go up, the towns in East Druin that had, not Druin, sorry, East Gippsland or wherever it might be that had them. They were actually, they would have been offended to see that in a similar way that you'll see in Sydney statues of Lachlan Macquarie covered in red paint. Why not? It makes perfect sense if you look at the history of it. And so the obscene reality is that what happened was, as it turns out, one of Macmillan's relations back in England had some descendants, okay? And one of those descendants was a very nice lady who's visited Victoria sometime in the late 20th and early 21st century, most likely the early 21st century, haven't got the exact date. And the story goes, because it's a word of mouth story, okay? And what she's done is she's gone to East Gippsland to see what footprint did the Macmillan family live in Australia. And she went, oh, what? And you want now? And you've got a statue of him, right? Yeah, fuck that. And then she's gone and she's talked to the local mob there and she's petitioned the government, said, no, the Macmillan family doesn't want that statue. Now, you shouldn't be glorifying a murderer. That's crap. They disown him. And she disowned him. No, he's not one of theirs. No, those people deserve better respect. And at that point, the Victorian government listened and the statue got replaced or removed somehow. And what's obscene about that is that it took that to happen. Someone who had was not from Australia and not been born and raised there, whose parents had not been born and raised there, someone who also wasn't responsible for those particular wars and massacres, someone someone who hadn't done the wrong thing, and wasn't, a survivor of it either, just because she was a distant relative of the offender, was somehow heard, whereas the survivors were not. So the Aboriginal people were not heard. The other people in the East Gippsland area were not heard, but that person was. And so that sort of placement of that sort of example of a placement of feasibility and plausibility of argument on those associated with the offender, in her case without actually being one at all, obviously, as opposed to the victim, is a type of Darvo. It is a type of Darvo which suggests that having a statue of Macmillan or Macquarie is an example of treating a criminal as a hero. Okay? Lachlan Macquarie started the Frontier Wars in 1816 with the Appin Massacre. His response to the Rum Rebellion was to go slam his fist down with as much iron and hardness as he could. He flogged the crap out of the Rum Rebels, and then he went to town on fucking killing a bunch of Aboriginal people as well, and didn't stop there. That policy continued well into the 1940s and spread across the entire continent, despite Queen Victoria having let its patent in relation to the colony of Adelaide, saying that the settlers were supposed to treat the native people with respect. Okay? What Lachlan Macquarie did was a criminal farce. Okay? He was a criminal. But there are universities named after him, there are suburbs named after him, there are statues of him in Sydney and other places. Okay? And if you live in those suburbs, or you've been to that university, or you work for that bank, okay, you're not at fault for that. But you need to know the legacy of that name. That's the legacy of a criminal. Okay? It's a legacy of a criminal. In a similar way that Macmillan was a legacy of a criminal as well. Okay? And so that sort of crusader-like logic of invading someone else's country and destroying everyone, or at least trying to, qualifying as heroism and having statues put up of them is just that. It's a means by which there's a subtle message sent to the community that bad behaviour is rewarded, that the offenders are given greater precedent than the victims. Another example of that in Australian history is, of course, the history of the Royal Commission. Okay, so Julia Gillard's a great hero in Australian history without being a criminal, because what she's done with Quentin Bryce, Robert McClellan, and the other justices involved in the Royal Commission into institutional responses into creepy shit. Don't even like saying it because it's creepy. Was that they gave a platform for witnesses and survivors of abuse in institutional contexts to have their voices heard, in some cases by people whose abuse went back to the 1950s and 1960s, who had encountered what people called the Catholic mafia when it came to the Catholic institutional response. It wasn't exclusively Catholic, but the Catholic Church and the Vatican had more witnesses than average, and quite a fair few. There were over 4,000 of them. And so the tabulation of that is a horrendous stain in Australian history. But what's the real stain? The real stain is that it was 50 years later for those victims. 50 years. If you're talking about the year 2014, you would, when cases go back in the 1950s, 1960s, okay, that's 50 years. That's 50 or 60 years of someone crying their eyes out and all the trauma responses that they would have had, and not being at 50, 60 years. Okay? That's a long time. And so for them to so they continued the Royal Commission under the Abbott government. So despite Abbott being friends of one of the people who did one of the worst cover-ups of them all, Cardinal George Pell, he did not do anything to stop that Royal Commission, which is to his credit. And despite the fact that we don't like him because he continued to be a friend with Cardinal George Pell even after he died, even so far as calling him a saint, which, unless you're using the term saint pejoratively like you would a crusader, sounds a bit stupid. Okay? Because Cardinal Pell was found to have covered up Ridsdale, who was one of the worst offenders in Australian history. like a massive proportion or out of proportion number of cases in that Royal Commission concerned Ballarat, okay, when Cardinal Pell was bishop there. Okay, you can't respect the man for that reason. Okay, sorry, Tony Abbott, you're lost. Even though you've been a firefighter and you've been a surf lifesaver, and in other respects you are a good man, Mr. Abbott, Mr. Tony Abbott, on that particular matter you suck massively. So we're glad you didn't do anything to stop that Royal Commission, but why the heck you stayed friends with him after that, we cannot comprehend. We can't comprehend it. It's like Donald Bloody Trump being friends with Jeffrey Epstein. What the fuck for? Okay? Even if Tony Abbott never once has done anything like that, and he probably hasn't. Okay? He probably never would. He would be genuinely offended by it. Okay? He's still someone who was unworthy of respect because he's coming from the culture of canonising the criminals. Okay? And we can't have anything but scorn for the memory of Cardinal George Pell because of that. Okay? So the amount of harm that caused was disgusting. So that idea of glorifying the criminals or defining the criminals as heroes is an issue. Okay? When it comes to things like Anzac Day, it is important that we remember history. We remember what happened. We even acknowledge that those people were, in fact, trying to defend our country. Okay? Because they were. Okay? It was the case that the Japanese bombed Darwin in World War II. It was the case that a sub went out in Sydney Harbour in World War II. It was the case that Hitler was planning to take over the world. And it was the case that Anzacs were fighting Hitler in France while the Americans were still collecting money from IBM, okay, for the typewriters that they had fucking sold to fucking Hitler. Okay? It is still the case that the Anzacs fought their guts out, and they do deserve acknowledgement for that. However, if you think war is not a crime, you're probably a lunatic, and that lunacy that was created for you was created by your culture. So perhaps it's time that you had a look at your culture and saw what it did to you and what it means for you to be a man if you're a man who's affected by that, or a woman who was told that you couldn't be a warrior either. Have a nice day.